Welcome, everyone. My name is Neville Smit. I'm the Director of Education of E-UNI University, and we're very, very pleased to be able to bring this special interview with Azual Skoll. We'll be talking about PvP and EVE and a whole bunch of other things. This is a Q&A session. You're going to be driving most of the content for this session, so please type your questions if you haven't done so already in our lecture.e-uni chat channel. We're very, very fortunate to have Azual joining us today. He's one of the EVE personalities that are well known for his expertise in player versus player combat. He is a former muckety-muck and bigwig in Agony Unleashed, a well-known PvP training corporation, and a very close partner of EVE University. And he's also author of the definitive EVE PvP blog, at least in my opinion. In fact, let me post the link to that in the chat channel, known as The Altruist. Should be required reading for anyone who's interested in PvP in EVE. So, Azual, I want to say on behalf of EVE University, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here.
Azual, let's start off with a little bit of background, and then we'll get right into the questions because we have a ton of them. And this is going to make this a very easy interview for me. Tell us a little bit how you got into EVE and how long you've been playing and what kind of experiences you've had that make you qualified as a PvP expert.
So I originally got into EVE about 5 years ago on the recommendation of a school friend who basically suggested I play EVE. He'd been playing for quite a while. So I tried it out. I made a trial, and he told me, right, the learning skills are the most important thing you can do, so just spend your first week training those learning skills. So I did that, and I decided that EVE was really boring, and then I quit. And I didn't start again until about a year after that. So early 2008, I created my current character, Azual Skoll. I decided to give it another go, because even though I found it really boring, there was just something about EVE that I found different to any other game. There's just something about it that drew me back. So I came back and I decided to give it another proper go, and that's really where I started out. I joined E-UNI after about a month in game, and I spent a little over half a year with EVE University, which was very good fun. I learned a lot about the game. I participated in a few wars, and this was when we had the privateer war deck that was about 4 months long, something like that. But I really got started in the game as a member of EVE-UNI. I then moved into a high-sec alliance called Spectrum Alliance, which is a kind of high-sec Care Bear alliance, where we did a bit of missioning and we did a little bit of PvP, but not really properly, and we weren't very good at it. We had a couple of war decks, which went quite badly for us, but as the only person who'd ever done any proper PvP in the past, I ended up being kind of our FC for those, and that was pretty interesting. It was a real challenge. I had no idea what I was doing. I was completely clueless, but it was quite fun nonetheless. And that's really what motivated me to get involved in PvP. So after that, I decided to check out Agony Unleashed because I'd heard them before. I'd heard about their PvP classes. So I took a couple of those classes. They were really good fun. I was really impressed with the guys that I found there as well. And I ended up joining Agony. And then, 3 years later, was a couple of months ago, and I'd managed to go from being some fresh raw recruit in Agony to being basically the guy running the corp, which was a little bit scary. And I decided it was time for a change. I was having great fun. The Agony guys are a really good bunch, but 3 years is a long time to do one thing in the game, and if you ever feel like you're just lunging in and doing the same thing every day, there's nothing stopping you from going and changing that, and there's so much you can do in EVE. So I just decided that I'm going to go off and do my own thing for a while, and going to experience some of the areas of the game that I hadn't done before. So that's where I am currently. I'm currently in my own corp, Skoll Heavy Industries, and just basically working on being a solo PvPer, living in low sec, doing a bit of null sec roaming as well, and having a good time.
And we see you hanging out and helping EVE University members in our chat channels all the time. We appreciate that too. So I know you still have a strong interest in helping new players and getting them a good experience in the game. To that end, I also see you continuing to maintain the Altruist blog, which I think is fantastic. When did you start that, and what motivated you to start a blog?
I started it at the end of 2010. This was actually motivated by EVE University as well. It was when I was reading one of the forums and someone asked a question about how to get started in solo PvP in a Tech 1 frigate. So I started writing a reply on the forum, and as happens when you tend to write a forum reply, it starts to get very long, like a big wall of text. And I decided, rather than just posting it there where this one guy was going to see it, maybe I should post it somewhere where loads of people could see it and where it'd actually be there if people want to refer to it later on. So that ended up being my first article, which was my Tech 1 frigate fishing article. That was, end of 2010, so a little while ago now. And I never really intended to make it a regular blog. It was kind of a place where, when I was posting something informational, I would put it on there as well. And then it'd be there for a bit of longevity. But it ended up being quite fun, and I think it's good not just because it's helping people, and it's quite a good feeling when you have people who come to you and say, look, your blog's been really helpful, get me into PvP, I've done this, and this, and it never would happen without that, so thanks very much. That's really great. But as well, I think it really helps you just sort out your thoughts. And there's a lot of times when I've been writing an article and I've realised things that maybe I hadn't got quite clear in my head before, or I realised there's something that actually I don't know. I've always assumed it's the case, but I don't know for sure, and then I go and check it out, and actually it's not what I think. So it's been quite a learning experience for me too.
Yeah, I noticed that some of the feedback that you get on there provokes additional thinking, and you follow up on that. It's a very, very good blog. I highly recommend it to everyone. Well, we have a ton of questions here, and so I'm just going to start feeding these to you. We are going to be jumping around quite a bit here, Azual, but feel free to comment or go off on tangents as you see fit. Go right ahead and get into the questions. The first one is from Maven Einstein. I've heard that not all PvPers use Tech 2 weapons, as sometimes they have fitting issues. What is your opinion about the relevance of Tech 2 guns, ammo, and tank in PvP?
So obviously T2 guns do more damage than T1 guns, which is nice. So if you have the option and you have the ISK, it's usually better to fit them. As you say, they do have higher fitting requirements, and that's a reason that you might not want to. You also might not want to just because you want to cut down the cost. And the important thing to think about here is why you actually would need T2 weapons. The main reason that you need to use T2 weapons is if you want to get a maximum range out of your guns, because you can't use the long-range T2 ammos without them. So that means sniping with long-range guns. It also means using barrage and scorch with close-range guns. Null is, I'd say, less defining. You don't really have as many styles of fit which rely on null ammo, whereas when you see a lot of, say, kiting battle cruisers, which really rely on having barrage or scorch ammo to actually hit out of their optimal ranges. So for stuff like that, T2 guns is really important, but if you're flying something that's going to be fairly close up, you can actually just get away with T1 guns quite easily, and it saves you a bit of ISK, it saves you a bit of fitting, especially if it's difficult to actually fit your ship because you've got low fitting skills. Sometimes when I'm going out and I'm going on a semi-suicidal solo PvP roam, I'll fit something that just has T1 guns on it. I think blasters especially, you can get away with it quite easily. In terms of tank, again, I wouldn't say there's such a big cutoff for tank, because there's not really anything that a T2 tank can do that a T1 tank can't. It's just slightly better. So, yeah, T2 tank is good if you can afford it, but it's not the be-all and end-all.
Azual, I noticed that in reading your blog and in some of your forum responses, you're always very authoritative, because I know you go out and test these things and do the research. I'm always impressed by the depth of the actual findings that you have from your own experience. How much do you, or how much time do you invest in actually testing different fits and PvP theories?
So a lot of it I don't have dedicated time testing it. It will be the result of something that I've just been out and done in PvP. So I've been flying a certain ship, or I've bought a certain ship, maybe I've talked to someone about it who flies one, and that will inform a lot of my posts. Sometimes I do go and test things specifically, so if I'm writing about a particular ship, I might actually go out and fly that just because I'm doing the article. Or for some things as well, I might go onto Singularity and test it out, mainly if it's something which is quite difficult to test on the main server where you're quite reliant on having a particular scenario. I wouldn't say that I commit huge amounts of time to dedicated testing. I do when there's something which I think really deserves it, like the bubble mechanics articles I wrote quite a while back, a couple of months ago I think it was. I spend quite a lot of time in Singularity just testing that, trying to make sure that I had all the mechanics completely right, because things like that, it's quite difficult to actually find good information on how everything works, and a little bit of difference can actually, yeah, it can be quite significant. So, for instance, the distance that you can get dragged by a drag pole, for example, if you say, oh yeah, you're only going to get dragged if you're within 100 kilometers, and that's wrong, that's going to cause a big problem for someone who relies on that information. So, with things like that, I do spend a lot of time dedicated testing it, but for most of it, not so much really.
Do you recommend that people go on CC or Singularity, the test server, and try things out, or do you think that is not really necessary?
I think it's a good idea if there's something that you want to test out, which would be very difficult to test out on the live server. If you want to maybe test a fit that's really expensive and you don't want to lose it the first time, or you want to test some mechanics, which would be quite difficult to do in reality because there'll be people around who are getting in your way and interfering, then it's good. But don't rely on it too much. Like, don't just go on Singularity and like test ships over and over again before you try them in the actual server, because then you'll just spend all your time on there. And yes, it can be good fun, but you end up with some people who just spend all their time on Singularity, and you got to remember that it is just the test server. It's not proper Eve.
Yeah, in that case, Eve is not real, to quote a phrase.
Yes.
To Zackle Zeroplex, that's a good starter question. As you know, we have a lot of new players in EVE University, and he asks, I'm just finishing the fitting of a Ferox for PvP. What should be my first steps if I want to get into PvP? So should I simply fly to 0-0 and begin to scan for problems, or what's the best way to get into it?
So if you're getting started in a battlecruiser, then I would say your best bet is to start off by flying with someone else who knows what they're doing, whether that's as part of an E-UNI fleet or whether it's just a single other person who knows their stuff and they say, hey, let's go have a bit of a roam. And the main reason for that is because battlecruisers are fairly expensive for a new player, and actually going out and getting your first taste in PvP in one, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you just go out by yourself before you're really familiar with how everything works, you'll probably find you lose the first few times, and that can be quite expensive for you. So yeah, I'd go out and go roaming with someone else, someone who you can take advice from, and that should really help you get into it a little bit. Obviously, you can go for frigates and learn in frigates as well. That makes it a little bit cheaper, but you don't have to do that. A lot of people recommend it, but you don't have to. And in some ways, starting in a slightly larger ship can be easier because fights last a little bit longer, and you have more time to take in what's going on and actually react to mistakes. Whereas generally when you go out in PvP in a frigate to begin with, you'll have a fight and then, within the first 10-20 seconds one of you's dead, and then you're actually doing the learning after the fight rather than during it.
Azual, we see a lot of fear from new players who are afraid to get into PvP because they don't want to lose their ship. They don't have a lot of ISK. Is it possible to become a good PvPer and not get over that fear?
Yes, absolutely it is. I think you'll find there's a lot of PvPers out there who are very, very cautious about their ships. They'll only take a fight with a gang, they won't go out by themselves, and they will only take a fight when they are guaranteed a win. So they'll make sure that they've got more numbers than the other people, they've got a couple of falcons, they can jam everything, and then they'll take the fight. But actually, if they ended up in a situation where they didn't have that backup, you'd probably find that they would panic and they would do something like log off and call some friends to come and help them because they didn't feel confident to get out of there by themselves. And yeah, I think there's actually quite a lot of people in that situation. So trying to get over that early is really, it's a good idea. And remember, it's only pixels, and that's what ISK is for. You make ISK so you can buy things, and then those things you'll eventually lose, or you'll sell them and get something else more expensive. But the ISK is there to be spent. ISK for ISK's sake is not that useful to you, unless you're role playing a banker, which this is.
And we have a few of those. Patrick Estamari asks, are missiles a viable weapon system in small gang and solo PvP?
Yes, absolutely. I think they've got a bit of a reputation because they're used in PvE, and a lot of people think, oh, they're a PvE weapon system, but actually they're just as effective for PvP as turrets are. You'll find that their absolute maximum damage output is a little bit less than turrets. Turrets, in an ideal situation, will do more damage. But turret damage quite easily drops off if you get close to someone or get too far away. For example, when you guys are flying frigates and you go out and you're in a gang, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that if you orbit someone, they have trouble hitting you. And you'll see the same thing in missions. If you're using turrets and there's something orbiting your frigate, you'll have trouble hitting it. Missiles don't really have that issue. Missiles are quite reliable in their damage, and they also tend to be able to hit out to really good range as well. And heavy missiles, sure, they do less damage than autocannons or artillery, but you can fire heavy missiles out to 100 kilometers and they'll still do just as much damage, and you can't say the same thing about turrets. So yes, they're very effective, they're very viable, they work in a slightly different way, and they maybe shine in slightly different circumstances, but yes, they're definitely worth using in small gang and solo PvP.
Mentro asks, this relates back to some of our getting started in PvP. We're going to have a lot of questions about that here today. How can a lower skill point player contribute or participate in PvP, as well as some of the more experienced veterans with higher skill points?
So, first thing to say about this is that actually the big hurdle is not the fact that you have lower skills or anything like that. It's usually that you are new to the game and you are less confident. That makes a huge difference, I think. You will be unsure of what you're doing. You won't be sure whether you're making the right decisions. Maybe you won't be making the right decisions. And I think that makes more difference than the fact that that person is just a high skill point PvPer. But if you go out and you're in a gang with some guys, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how many skill points you have or anything. If maybe got a couple of guys who've got really low skill points, and you take on one guy who's got loads of skill points, loads of experience, you can still have a good fight. And they will know that because they'll see your character age and they'll see your corporation as E-UNI and they'll think, well, these are newer players. So you can actually still get really good fights even though you don't have the experience that the other guys do, because it just ends up evening itself out, I think. And of course there are some volds that you can get into very quickly and end up with almost optimal skills for them. Tackling is the obvious one. Also electronic warfare, both of those you can get into very, very quickly with some basic skills. And with a few months training, you can end up in a situation where actually you've got almost as many skills in that area as an experienced player would. So aside from actually getting some time under your belt doing things, you can be as effective a tackler as a couple of months into the game as an experienced player who's been around 4 or 5 years would be.
Talon James asks, in your opinion, Azual, what is the best solo PvP ship and why?
It's the Ferox. And that might be a surprising answer for people. That is what I... obviously there isn't a best, but that is one ship which is really good for solo PvP, and it's one that I'm using a lot at the moment. It's probably my favourite at the moment. And the reason for this is that solo PvP, much more so than gang PvP, isn't just about how good your ship is. It's also about how good people think your ship is. Unless you manage to catch someone unawares, you catch someone when they're ratting in a belt, or you tackle someone on the gate, a lot of solo PvP happens in a situation where it's kind of consensual. So, if someone doesn't want to fight you and they just want to run away, then they won't fight you. They will just run away from you. If you come in with you've got a hurricane and they've got a rupture, they're probably not going to fight you, so they're just going to fly away. But if they think they can kill you, then you'll get a fight. And that's the big part of solo PvP. I'd say more than half of the game of solo PvP is actually getting the fights in the first place. And the great thing about the Ferox, and there's other ships that this is true of as well, but the Ferox is a really good example of it, is it's a ship that's incredibly underrated. If you see a Ferox, most people think, okay, it's someone who doesn't know what they're doing, because no one really flies Feroxes. It's not going to be very effective, because generally the Ferox underperforms compared to other battlecruisers. They might think that you're just some newbie or some mission runner who's accidentally strayed into low-sec or null-sec. And they will try and kill you because they'll think, Ferox isn't going to hurt me, I can kill it quite easily. In actual fact, the Ferox isn't a bad ship at all. It does underperform compared to the others, but not by a lot. It still does quite a lot of damage, it still has quite a lot of tank, and you've got loads of mid-slots as well, which are nice for scrams and webs and things. So, it tends to be really easy to get fight, and people will fight you with things that you can kill quite easily because they'll just underestimate you so much. Whereas if you flew a Drake or a Hurricane, on the other hand, you're better than the Ferox, but everyone thinks that those ships are really good. People actually overestimate those ships, so they would run away when in fact they could kill you. Whereas with the Ferox, they will fight you when in fact they don't really stand a chance.
Is there any special trick to fitting a Ferox? I mean, it's not the first ship I hear about, outfitting for solo PvP. Is there something unusual that you have to do to give it a special advantage?
Well, the one thing is, I would not fit a whale Ferox for solo PvP. If you're doing solo, you'll generally want to fit for close range. So fit it with blasters. That's slightly unusual because the Ferox gets a range bonus. But actually, that bonus works just as well for blasters as it does for whales. My personal Ferox fit, in fact, I probably got it saved. I can link it in chat. One sec.
That'd be great.
So that's the Ferox fit that I'm using at the moment. There are a few different ones that work. You don't have to fit it a particular way. So this is Blaster Ferox. It's got 2 webs and a scram. And that means that it's really good for fighting frigate gangs. So I'd be quite confident taking on a gang of 4 or 5 destroyers or assault frigates with this Ferox, and I could probably win. Because they've got 5 people, so they're absolutely bound to engage you if you warp into that gang. But actually, with 2 webs, you can slow down a frigate or a destroyer to almost nothing, and you can hit it quite easily. And then it's got enough tank still with its resist bonus and 1 shield extender damage control to just about pull through. There are other fits that work well as well. You can lose the webs and the shield buffer and go for an active tank, or you can just fit it with more buffer than this. I mean, this is quite a lightly tanked fit, really. There are lots of fits that work, and the general thing is not the fit itself, it's just the fact that it's actually not a bad ship, but everyone thinks it's a bad ship. It's kind of like a Drake, but with less range and 1 less mid slot. So, if that gives you any idea.
Excellent. Thank you. Louis de Montfort asks, what is an aspect of PvP play, in your opinion, that is most often ignored or poorly executed, even among experienced players?
That's a difficult one.
Well, if I can elaborate on that, you mentioned confidence, for example. Is it simply confidence, or what do you think it is?
There are loads of things that experienced players do wrong. Experienced players, despite what you would think, are not actually that good for the most part. They've got experience, but they still make loads of mistakes, and the really obvious one is fitting your ships. You will quite often end up fighting someone they've been PvPing for years. They've got hundreds or thousands of kills under their belt, usually in gangs and things. And then you go to fight them, and you'll think it's going to be a really hard fight, and then they'll just die really easily, and then you look at the fit afterwards, and they've done something like fit a ship with no tank at all and 4 sensor boosters. It's really surprising how often that happens. So, yeah, there are loads of things I could pick for this, but I'm going to pick that. So fitting a ship is something that experienced players really often do wrong. And that's something you should bear in mind. If you're going out and solo PvPing, it's often quite safe to bet on the fact that someone won't be quite as good as you expect them to be. If you're good at fitting ships yourself, and you find someone else, you'll expect their fit to be decent, usually. But actually, a lot of the time it's not. So if you get your head around fitting ships, and you fit your ships in a sensible way, then you'll almost always have an advantage, even against experienced guys, I think.
Kexar asks, cloaky ships a good way of getting started in PvP, or is it better to start and lose with a lot of Tech 1 ships and then work your way up from there?
I would say stick with the Tech 1 ships. The thing about cloakies is, yes, they're very effective, but they tend to get you into a very cautious mindset, because obviously you're trying to evade things and you're being stealthy. And actually, I think starting off in a cloaky, because you're in a quite expensive ship and you're in that cautious mindset, means that you will be quite risk averse in what you're doing. You'll only take fights where you're fairly confident that you can kill it, because you don't really want to lose your expensive cloaky ship. And that means you're not actually challenging yourself that much. I think when you're going out and starting off in PvP, but especially because you often don't really know what you can kill and what you can't, you want to try flying something where if you try and take a fight that you think maybe you can kill, and then you can't kill them, it's actually not a big deal, because you've just lost a fairly cheap ship and you've learned something for it.
Question is, do you have, this is from Patrick Estamari again, do you have a favorite Tech 3 cruiser for PvP, and why?
So I don't really PvP in Tech 3 cruisers. I do own a Loki, which I used a while ago for hunting erratas in deep nullsec, but I don't really fly it these days. I would say if I had the choice of having one to PvP in, I would absolutely definitely go for a Tengu. I think that's partly just because the kind of balance situation at the moment, the Tengu is just so effective. It can do just about everything, whereas the other T3s tend to be quite limited in their roles. They do one or two things really well, but not everything. Whereas the Tengu is just a great all-rounder ship, I think.
Maven Einstein asks, if you were to pick one race's frigates to take to level 5, to train to level 5, to get to their advanced ships, which race would you pick first?
I think it would probably be a toss-up between Minmatar and Gallente. I think Caldari is also very strong at the moment. The Hawk is absolutely brilliant. But Minmatar and Gallente probably, just because of the number of really good ships that they have in the T2 frigates. I think all 4 races are actually very strong at the moment, but those 2 I particularly like. I don't think, apart from the electronic attack frigates, in both cases are not very good. The Amar and Caldari ones are much better. But apart from those, I don't think that the Minmatar Gallente have a bad T2 frigate. I think all of their frigates are actually really useful.
Yeah, assault frigates especially are fantastic. I do love the Gallente ones, but I'm prejudiced. Marxo Aduan asks, despite their PvE bonuses, some people set up Marauder-class battleships for PvP. What's your opinion on Marauders for PvP?
So obviously they're very expensive, and the same thing is true with faction battleships as well, but they're very expensive, so you have to have a lot of this before you can actually start using them in any kind of semi-risky PvP. Any expensive ship is going to give you the tendency to avoid fights that involve some risk, I think. Doesn't mean you can't use them, though. Doesn't mean they're not good ships to use. I would say of the Marauders, the Paladin and Kronos are actually quite viable PvP ships. They've got a web bonus, which is awesome. It means that their webs are super effective. Basically, 2 webs one web is the same as 2 normal webs. And also, they actually have the power grid and CPU to fit useful things in their extra high slots. The Varga especially is very limited on the CPU and power grid front, so you can't really fit things like newts and stuff like that in its high slots. So Paladin and Kronos I think are pretty decent. The only thing to bear in mind with Marauders, of course, is their sensor strength is really low. So even ECM drones are going to cause you a potential problem, because you're going to get jammed quite easily.
Kenshin Nomura asks an interesting question. How do you evaluate an enemy or a potential enemy? Do you play with them? Do you bait them? Do you harass them in local? I mean, what aspects of behavior in your target are you looking for?
So a lot of people do different things, I think. So I'll tell you what I do. I don't think this is what everyone does, but this is what I do. Like I said before, a lot of solo PvP has to be semi-consensual, at least to begin with. They have to want to fight you, at least until you've got them tackled. Once you've got them tackled and they're aggressed, they can want to run away as much as they like because it's over and you've got them. So what I would usually do if I want to try and fight someone is that I'll act like I don't necessarily want to fight. So I will maybe hold at range for them, line away to something, and just see what they do to begin with. If they just carry on with their business, if they've just landed on a gate and I'm sitting around there, and they carry on and just kind of go through the gate or warp off to wherever they were going, they probably weren't looking for a fight. If they hang around a grid, or if they start approaching me or something, then I know that they want to fight me, and at that point I can start thinking about where I want to fight them. Do I want to fight them here? Do I want to warp off and get them to chase me somewhere? But I'd say the first thing to do is just try and get a sense of whether the other person wants to fight you or not. If they don't want to fight you, it doesn't mean that you can't fight them. If you're fairly fast and you've got tackle, then obviously you've got tackle, but if you've got fast, good tackle, then you could chase them and you could catch them, potentially. But usually seeing whether they actually want to fight or not is a really good thing to begin with. And the other thing as well is, if they're in something which you think you can kill really easily, so if you are flying a battle cruiser and they're in, say, a cheap Tech 1 cruiser, and they look like they want to fight you, that is a warning sign right there. That means they've probably got backup, or maybe they've got a Sino fitted or something like that. If they're doing something which just doesn't seem sensible for the kind of ship that they're in, then it can be useful to know that in advance. So that's another advantage of kind of seeing what they try to do before you actually commit to the fight.
Nair Aldero asks, is NPC nullsec space viable in your opinion for solo or small gang PvP, say up to 3 or 4 players, or would you prefer low sec for that?
Yes, MC nullsec is absolutely great for small gang solo PvP, I think. Probably the biggest advantage it has over low sec is the fact that there are no gate guns, and there's no such thing as GCC. So if you find someone on a gate, which is where most of the encounters tend to happen, you're traveling around, someone else is traveling around, and you end up landing on a gate together, or one of you comes through to the other one, you can actually start a fight there. And what that means is that fights don't just happen between people who are looking for fights. In low sec, it tends to be either your fight happens because someone's ratting and you go and catch them, or you're looking for a fight and someone else is looking for a fight and you both warp to belt and then you happen to bounce into each other. In NPC and nullsec, you can be flying around and you can encounter someone who actually wasn't looking for a fight, they were just traveling. But as it happens, they're in a PvP fit ship and you look like a good target, and then a fight happens there. So I think it's easier to get fights in NPC nullsec, and that's really good. The one downside is that, so you've got bubbles, which so that's an extra mechanic to take into account if you're quite new, and also you do tend to get bigger gangs in nullsec, less so in NPC nullsec than you do in sub nullsec, but even in NPC nullsec it's quite common to have gangs of between 10 and 30 flying around, and if you're just a couple of people, you're going to have your wits about you to avoid those.
Maven asks a follow-up question. Have you done any wormhole space exploration? And if so, what would you recommend as the Tech 3 ship to get into that could be fit for PvE but still be viable for PvP?
No, I haven't done any wormhole stuff myself. That's actually something that I'd be quite interested in doing, maybe some point in the next couple of months. In terms of the ships, though, I would say, again, the Tengu. The reason for this is that, again, it's a very good all-rounder, and you can actually fit it to be a viable PvE ship and a viable PvP ship at the same time. The others, as I said, they are slightly more one-trick ponies, so you can fit them to do one thing really well, but they don't necessarily do everything else really well at the same time. So if you do a PvE fit Proteus, for example, it won't necessarily be good if it's put into a PvP situation without warning. Whereas a Tengu, on the other hand, especially if you go for one of these 100 MN Afterburner Tengus, which are very popular at the moment, you can have something which is actually a really viable PvE setup, but as soon as someone starts PvPing it, it's still a really viable PvP setup too. I think that's a really good advantage.
Victus Vegas asks, I've seen your blog, The Altruist, for the first time. Which articles would you recommend right away for new PvPers on your blog?
So, if you're a new PvPer, I'd say check out the very first article, which is the Interceptor Fishing one. That basically talks about a technique for fighting interceptors and Tech 2 frigates using a cheap Tech 1 frigate, and how you can get them to fight you and how you can kill them. So that's quite useful if you are just getting into PvP, you're in a fairly cheap ship, but you want to see what targets you can actually take on and how you might go about it. I would also say check out the Know Your Enemy T1 Frigates article, which you should be able to find in the article index. That just talks about all the different T1 frigs and their strengths and weaknesses. It mainly does it from the opponent's perspective. So if you are going to fight a Rifter, what do you have to look out for, etc., etc. But you can also use that information when you're picking the ships for yourself to use. So I'd say that's quite useful for a new player as well. Also, maybe check out the one I did recently on how to fund your PvP, because I think that's quite a useful thing to know when you're starting out. A lot of people have ISK worries when they're starting out PvPing, and having at least a plan in mind on how you're going to keep paying for it is quite a good idea.
Patrice McMahon is one of our teachers here at EVE University and asks a question I'm interested in as well. When you were with Agony Empire, it was well known as the PvP university, if you will. Very strong curriculum of practically oriented exercise-based classes designed to teach PvP. As a director of Agony, how much were you involved in the planning of the class content, and can you share with us how you went about designing those kinds of courses to make them effective?
So yes, I was very involved in designing the class content. The classes that you see currently, the only one of our main classes that I didn't design is Wolfpacks. I had a hand in that, but that was mainly the current curriculum was written by someone else. What you see on Basic at the moment and Advanced was mainly written by me. A lot of it was there before I started, and things have been shuffled around and amended as we went through. But most of that was my work, I suppose. In terms of how we put it together, we have the advantage. It's a disadvantage and an advantage at the same time. But we have the advantage that we only run a fairly small number of classes around a fairly singular topic, which is of course PvP. We do different aspects of it, but it's all about PvP. And also the classes tend to be run by the same people, so you can quite easily get a feel for what is working in the class and what isn't. Because you're running it so often as well, the same class so often, you again will get a feel for which parts the students are getting, which parts they aren't getting. In terms of replicating that when you're designing in class yourself here, what I would say is, when you're coming up with the idea, maybe get some potential, get some trial students, if you will, some guys who don't know much about the area but they're willing to learn, and maybe just try it out on them, and then get some feedback from them. We always have a feedback thread after the class, and we always really encourage students to come there and give us their feedback, because actually getting from them, which bits made sense and just clicked for you, which bits did you not really understand, what did my explanation for this make sense or not. I think that can be really useful, because often you can come to the end of a class and you think, no, that went terribly, or that went amazing, and then you talk to a student and you actually find out that sometimes you're right, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you think something went badly and they said, oh, actually the way you explained that just made sense, and actually the only reason you explained it that way is because you forgot how you're supposed to do it and you did it wrong, but somehow it worked better. So definitely student feedback makes a really big difference. I'd say that's just a really important thing. And the other thing, of course, is keep running them. Don't just write a class and do it once. Write a class, do it, get some feedback, then run it again, taking into account that feedback, make some changes, and don't forget to, of course, write down the curriculum that you end up using and what you changed and why, because future instructors who come to teach the same class, you don't want them to start square zero again, so make sure they've got the benefit of your knowledge as well.
Excellent advice. Thank you. You were known for your Know the Enemy series. There's going to be a whole bunch of new ship rebalancing coming out. CCP has announced that. Will you revisit your Know Your Enemy series, starting with the T1 frigs, or is that too much work and you won't be able to do that?
Yes, I'm definitely planning to do that. I've already rewritten some of the ones, so like Destroyers, I've already rewritten based on the balancing that happened there. And some of the ships like the Aneris, where they've changed it, I've updated those as well. I haven't done assault frigs yet, just because I haven't got around to it, and I'm still getting a feel for how they actually work. But yeah, when the T1 frigate balancing and stuff comes in, then I definitely plan to update those articles again.
Michio Kato asked a question that relates to your latest post on the blog. You mentioned it earlier, that is funding your PvP habit. Do you need a day job, quote unquote, to fund a PvP character? How do you give us a couple highlights or tips, if you could, about how to fund your PvP habit?
So no, you need a day job. If you decide that all you want to do in EVE is PvP, you can do that. You might have to think about the kind of PvP you do and the kind of ships you fly, so you'll need to make sure you're flying ships that are within your budget. If you know that you can make so much a month off just looting your opponents and things like that, then fly ships that you can afford with that much money. Don't start off by picking the ships that you want to fly and then trying to figure out how you can afford them, unless you're happy to do whatever it takes to actually pay for that. If you know, right, I'm willing to spend like 1 day per month actually making some ISK, and then the rest of it I'm just going to PvP, you can just set your budget so that however much ISK you can make in a day, that's how much you're actually going to be using. The other thing is there are a couple of ways that you can actually PvP and make money from it, or at least cover your costs by doing the PvP itself. One of those is piracy, obviously. Piracy, you tend to go for targets where there's some money in it for you, so you won't just fight those targets, but you'll be trying to go for mission runners, for example, where you think they might have some expensive mods on there, or you might try and capture someone because you think that you can ransom them and then you can get some money for that. and you can actually end up in a situation quite easily where you're covering your costs. Actually making a big profit is more difficult, but covering your costs is not that difficult to do if you pick targets sensibly. The other one, of course, is alliance PvP. If you are with a fairly large alliance, they tend to have a lot of passive income from things like their moons and stuff like that, and it's fairly common for them to have some kind of ship replacement program. So if you decide that you're interested in big fights, you're interested in epic scale, 1,000 versus 1,000 battles, and you want to PvP and you want to not have to earn ISK for that PvP, if you join an alliance like that that's got a ship replacement program, it means that you can actually get paid for the ships that you lose. So if you lose your Drake in a battle, they might say, alright, we're replacing Drakes, so here you go, you have a new one. Or they might say there's some key ships they need, like we really need people to fly interdictors and interceptors and logistics. So you can train for those ships because you know you're going to get reimbursed for them if you lose them. And that way you're basically PvPing for free.
Maven asks a good question here. You mentioned the Ferox is your current favorite ship and fit. But what is the ship or racial style that gives you the most trouble and why?
The ship that gives me the most trouble?
Yeah, either the ship or the his question is what racial style of shore or family of ships.
So I think the ship that gives every solo PvPer the most trouble is the Falcon, obviously. If a gang has a Falcon, basically can't fight them unless they do something wrong. Like if their Falcon gets out of range of you or something like that, then you can fight them. But otherwise, one Falcon can perma-jam just about any solo ship. So that causes a lot of problems for a solo PvP. So in terms of the one ship that causes me the most grief, it's got to be Falcons. They're a valid part of the game, and I don't go to the lengths that other people do, raging about how terrible they are, but they do definitely make PvP as a solo quite difficult. In terms of... So I go?
No, I was going to say, I think what Maven was getting here is also what's your least favorite ship, or what's the hardest that you find a ship to fit and fly?
Is it to fit and fly or to fight against?
No, I think this is for you personally. If you were going to pick a ship to outfit for PvP, which one do you think would give you the most trouble and why?
Okay. In terms of fitting the ships, I think that fitting Amar ships is quite difficult. They tend to have really weak CPU, so actually getting damage mods and things on them can be really quite tricky. Now, also, the low number of mid-slots makes them quite difficult to fit as well. In terms of flying, I think the one that is the most challenging is probably when you go for really light tanked, fast kiting ships. Just because they can be really effective, but also because you're moving so quickly and you don't have that much tank, it's very easy to actually make a mistake and lose it. Whereas when you find something fairly beefy and fairly slow, there's not really as much that you can do wrong, which will have a huge impact. You can make a mistake and that loses you the fight, but it's not like there's not quite as much pressure on you to get everything right, and one mistake you can usually recover from, whereas one mistake in a really lightly tanked ship one mistake can do the whole thing, and then you're done for.
Very good. Doris Keldar asks, if you were in a small gang situation, I assume this would be a nullsec, and if you've been caught in a bubble, what is the best way to escape, either for a remote bubble or a heavy interdictor one?
So I assume by that you mean either a drag bubble or a bubble on a gate?
Yes, let's assume a bubble on the gate here.
So if you're in a bubble on the gate, you basically have two choices. You can either try and fly out of the bubble, or you can reapproach the gate. 9 times out of 10, you'll have a better chance of escaping if you reapproach the gate. Because there'll be a couple of seconds as you G-click before you actually appear on people's screens, they can start locking you. By that point, you're already up to speed a little bit. You've only got about 12 kilometers to go anyway. So usually, if you start reapproaching the gate, you just turn your micro-warps on, overheat your micro-warps if you can. You will usually make it back. Some people will probably be aggressed because they'll have been shooting you and trying to tackle you as you get back. So quite often, if you make it back to the gate, you can get through and you can escape. Some smart campers will send someone through to the other side immediately as soon as someone comes through to them. So they've got tackle on the far side as well. But if you're in the gang, there's a good chance that at least most of you can get out that way. Basically, the only time when burning out of the bubble will be more effective is if you know that you have a big speed advantage. So say they are a battleship gang, and they don't really have any fast scramming webbing ships. You are flying fast battlecruisers, say. In that situation, you can probably just align out of the bubble and start burning with your micro warp on, and you'll get outside anyone's tackle range before you actually die. So if you just start aligning for something, try and aim for something which is close to the edge of the bubble you're nearest, so that you're not going straight through to the other side of the bubble, so you're going out to the nearest edge. Just turn your micro warp on again, or afterburner, whatever you've got. Overheat it if you can, and then you should find you're able to break out of their tackle range and warp off. But that only really works if they don't have either they don't have long range recons like an Azual, because they can tackle you from miles away, and they don't have anything fast with a scram web type thing. So if they got like assault frigs or dramils or something, that's probably not a good idea. But if they're mainly just big slow ships, you can usually get away with that.
Very good. Poe asks, what are the best ways to learn what engagements are within your range of survival so that you don't lose ships unnecessarily? In other words, how do you gauge whether or not you have a potential fight that you can win?
It's a tricky one. The best way to do it is trial and error, but that's also the most expensive way to do it, because when you try and it is an error, then you lose your ship. So that can be an expensive way to learn, but that's definitely the most effective way to do it, because you'll actually know for sure. Otherwise, I guess it's just it's partly just using common sense, learning about all the different ships. And that's why I wrote the Know Your Enemy articles, was just try and help people with that one. So learn about all the ships that are out there, try and learn what they're capable of, and you should be able to get an idea of when something might be a decent fight for you and not. Like, for example, if you know that a curse has these incredibly powerful newts that can hit out to 30 kilometers and it's got loads of drones, that tells you that fighting a curse in your assault frigate is probably a really bad idea, because it will cap you out and its drones will eat you. Whereas if you went up against, I don't know, maybe the same curse but in a battlecruiser battleship that uses capless weapons and missiles or projectiles, you know what it does, and you know that actually a swarm of light drones and a bunch of newts isn't that much of a problem for you, because you don't really rely on your cap and you've got plenty of tank. So learning what the opposing ships are capable of is a really big thing. The other thing I would say is that more often than not, you will overestimate your opponent. So you will, if you find something which is a fairly even fight, your first reaction to that will be, whoa, they can kill me. And that seems to be the case for a lot of people. It's not necessarily for everyone, but if you look at people out there, most people will see a fight that actually they could win, but it's close, and their first reaction will be, this is a dangerous fight, I could lose this fight, this guy's probably going to kill me. Whereas in actual fact, if you took the fight, they'd probably have an even or better chance of winning. So if you find an opponent and you're not sure whether you can take the fight, this is true solo and in gang. If you're not sure, but you're not certain that you would lose, but you're not sure, then I would say just go for it, because if you're in that situation quite often, bearing in mind you'll naturally overestimate them, you'll actually have a good chance in the fight. Of course, the challenge there is that if you do end up with a fight that you could potentially win, the other person's probably going to be in the opposite mindset and they're thinking that they can lose too. So you may have to actually get them to fight you.
Thoris asks a follow-up question here. It's kind of specific. What are your opinions on AHARM and the Rooks and Kings playstyles for PvP?
I don't know very much about AHARM's place other than what I've seen in the Rooks and Kings videos. I know that they're a wormhole corp, and I know that they're quite effective at what they do. I do know about their I think there was an exploit with magnetile wormholes a while back that they got involved in, but we won't get into that just now. In terms of Rooks and Kings, obviously I have encountered them quite a lot because I used to live in Syndicate. I still do roam in Syndicate quite a lot, and they live close to there. I think that obviously they're really good at what they do. They have a fairly specific playstyle that they play, which is big, heavy armor tank battleships and capital carrier support. And they do that stuff a lot, and they do it very well. And because they're focused on a particular area, they are very, very effective in that area, much more so than even some of the really big, powerful alliances who have loads of manpower and loads of ISK, but they don't necessarily focus on one particular area so much. So when they end up in a situation where they're fighting their kind of armed battleship and capital gang against a Rooks and Kings one, they're always at a disadvantage. So, yeah, they're really good at what they do, but what they do is quite limited. So I think if that's what interests you, if you're really interested in like small gang capital warfare and logistics battleship gangs, then yeah, that's great. If you want a slightly broader experience of PvP, then maybe that's not the kind of corp you want to go for, because they are very specialized and they won't necessarily do all the things you want to do.
Daniel asks, what do you recommend to someone who's interested in starting their own PvP corporation?
Well, I haven't started my own PvP corporation ever, so take my advice, well, unless you count my alt core, which is currently just me, so take my advice with a grain of salt. But the first thing is, you should make sure you're in a situation where you are comfortable making things happen. If you've started the corporation, you're the CEO, the founder, it's going to be expected that you are going to be instigating PvP. So when people are sitting around the station, you've got to be okay that you're the guy who's going to step up and say, right, okay, we're going to go on a roam, or I'm going to go out soloing, who's going to come with me, kind of thing. A lot of people have trouble doing that. A lot of people like to think that they'll be able to do that, but actually when they get into the situation, they are kind of just sitting around waiting for someone else to make it happen. And if nothing is happening in your corp, then people are not going to want to join your corp, and people aren't going to be happy in your corp. So you've got to make sure that you are able to make things happen. Sometimes you'll have someone join the corp who will also do that, and that's great, but you've got to be happy with doing it yourself. You've also got to be happy, I guess, working with whatever numbers you have. If you're starting off a corp and you'll probably have fairly low activity levels. I've never found a corp where people say we are too active, our gangs have too many people in them. Most people are talking about how we just don't quite have enough members at the moment and that kind of stuff. So if you log in one day and you've only got 5 people online, you've got to be happy PvPing with 5 people. Now, especially until you actually get your name out there and get respected as a PvP corp, you'll usually have fewer members than you want to have, unless you want to be completely solo, of course. So you've got to be happy with that. Otherwise, just go ahead and do it. But I think this is true with a PvP corp as well as any other kind of corp. You've got to make sure you know what your corp is about and why people would be interested in joining your corp. Don't just create something because it's great to own something that has your name on it and then realize that actually you don't have anything to offer people. There's nothing special about your corp that means they should come and join you. If you're going to be recruiting people, you've got to know what it is that you're selling.
Intonicus asks, is it harder, in your opinion, than it used to be to get into solo or small gang PvP in EVE today?
So, possibly, but not by as much as people will tell you. A lot of people will tell you things like solo PvP is dead, or LoSec is dead, or EVE is nothing like it was a few years ago, and things were so easy back then. I think it's partly a case of the old rose-tinted glasses. I've been playing EVE for about 4 years, and it's always been really hard to get into solo PvP. It's never been easy. And maybe sometimes it was easier in the past. Maybe there were fewer large gangs, and gangs had worse compositions, so you had less chance of running into logistics and things like that. But it's always been difficult, and it's not that much more difficult now. It's still possible to do. It's not easy, and it takes some commitment, but it's still possible to get into it, even as a new player. So I would say when people tell you that solo PvP is dead, or that it's really hard to get into it now, don't necessarily listen to that advice. Maybe they're right, but even if they are right, taking their advice to heart is not actually going to help you get into it. It's just going to put you off. So just go out and try it, and trust me, it is possible. There are loads of people who get into it every day, new players. So don't worry about it too much.
A little earlier, you shared your fit for your current favorite Ferox. Almighty Mo would like to know, do you keep your fits fairly unique and top secret, or do you typically use fits that are well known and frequently discussed?
So if I lose a ship, you're going to be able to see the kill mail anyway on the kill board somewhere. So I don't try to be too secretive in my fits. If I fight someone and they ask me, after the fight, or how was I fit, I will tell them my fit. I've got no problem with doing that. I generally will avoid telling people in advance of a fight what fit I'm using, just because if you're doing that and you're out solo, people will quite often fit specifically to kill you. In terms of choosing my fits in the first place, I like to try and keep things a little bit unusual. Some of my fits are fairly cookie cutter, it's got to be said, and things like my hurricanes and stuff are fairly normal, shield kiting hurricanes, just because that fit is so effective. But I think there's definitely something to be said for using a fit, especially if you're solo, that people won't necessarily expect, just because, again, it goes into the same thing I was talking about when we talked about the Ferox at the beginning. People will expect a cookie cutter fit, so that if you're flying a hurricane, they'll expect you to be shield tanked, they'll expect loads of DPS and quite a lot of speed and not that much tank, maybe a couple of newts. If you're actually flying, say, an armor tanked hurricane with 2 webs on it and 180mm guns that are quite good tracking, they're not going to expect that. So they might fly in a way that would counter a typical hurricane fit, and then they'll end up losing to you because you're not flying a typical fit. So there's definitely something to be said for using unconventional fits, and I do try to do that every now and then. I wouldn't say that all my fits are like that, but some of them definitely are. Probably the best example is when I was in RVB, which I was a member of for about a month, a while ago. I used to fly a Merlin that had pulse lasers and an armor tank, and that was awesome. That was a really good fit because it could just about kill any other frigate 1v1 because they wouldn't expect it to do it. And because you had all your mid slots free, you could just fit webs and tracking disruptors and stuff, and you'd kind of hold them at 10k and shoot them with pulse lasers and scorch. And that's quite awesome. But it's a niche fit, I think.
Earlier you mentioned that getting into PvP or solo PvP was always a little difficult, but let me paraphrase Scientific's question here. Do you think that CCP should do anything to encourage small gang playstyle, maybe as a ladder on to something else? What kind of changes would you like to see in EVE, perhaps, to encourage more solo or small gang PvP?
So I do actually think that CCP do what they can to encourage it. They realise it's an important playstyle, but it's very difficult to actually find anything that will encourage it, because at the end of the day, if you've got one ship and someone else has 2 of the same ship, they have an advantage, and you can't really change that. Numbers are, whatever you do, numbers are always going to be an advantage, and that makes solo PvP difficult. Things like the faction warfare plexes. So for those who don't know, in low-second faction warfare, for example, you'll get plexes, which are a dead space complex that appears on your overview of your scanner. And only particular ship types can get into those. So for example, you might have one where it's just frigates that can get in. So you can go there in a frigate, and you know that if someone else turns up, they will have to be in a frigate, and then you can get a fairly decent balanced fight. And stuff like that is good, and it does encourage solo PvP and small ship PvP and stuff like that. But it's very difficult to actually, for CCP to do something to encourage it, especially because they don't want to prescribe a particular playstyle as well. One thing that CCP is very proud of is the sandbox nature of EVE. They don't want to say, right, okay, you should play this way, you should play that way. They give us the tools, and then people play the way they want to. But I think in terms of preserving solo PvP as a playstyle, yes, I think that they should do stuff to that. I think they do as well, but they don't necessarily get credit for it, and it's not like big sweeping things. But it's something which is on their mind.
Sutras STZ alludes to something I wanted to ask you as well, and that is when you typically hear about solo or small gang PvP, the ship that's usually mentioned, or one of the ones that are mentioned, is the Tyrannus. Surprised to not hear you mention the Tyrannus. What's your opinion of the Tyrannus as a PvP platform?
I think it's a really good ship. Up until probably about 6 months ago, something like that, the Tyrannus was my main solo PvP ship. Of the combat interceptors, it's probably it's definitely the most powerful as a brawler. So it's got the best damage output. It's a bit slower than the rest, but it's good damage output. And because it's Galente, it's got a lot of structure HP, so you can get a decent tank just by fitting a damage control, which is nice. So it's really, really good for just kind of in-your-face, close-range brawling. I think the assault ship buff has weakened the Tyrannus relatively, because a lot of the ships that it could kill before, it used to be able to kill some destroyers and some assault frigs. Now, it probably can't. They've they've got buffed a little bit and it's been left behind slightly. I still think it's a really good ship. It's a great ship for fighting ships bigger than yourself, because it's got a low signature radius, it's got high DPS up close, and it's quite fast, even with an afterburner. So if you've got an afterburner Tyrannus with the scram webs and blasters, if you can get a fight against a cruiser or a battle cruiser, and you can just get in and orbit under their guns, it's a great ship for that kind of stuff. It's also still really good for fighting other frigates, but obviously you have to pick your targets a little bit better now, because it can't necessarily kill everything.
Patheus Atticus asks, I'd like to hear some suggestions from you about tactical bookmarks and how you label and organize them.
So I actually wrote an article on bookmarks, which I will find and link in chat. Okay, so yeah, that's an article I wrote a while back on tactical bookmarks. They're a really useful thing to have. I wouldn't say they're essential, and you can get into a situation where you rely on them a little bit too much. They're particularly good if you're FCing or if you're scouting, because you'll either be warping the fleet to them or you'll be moving ahead of a gang and you don't know what's ahead of you, so they're quite useful in those situations. Obviously, if you are based in a particular place, it makes a lot of sense to just set them up around wherever you live as well, just so that you've got a little bit of a home advantage when someone declares war on you or what have you. I would say in terms of naming them, just make sure you name it in a way where it's quite short, so you don't have loads and loads of information you try to decipher, and also do it in a way that makes sense to you. So if the easiest way for you to understand what tactical bookmark says is that it's just written out like a sentence, like, you know, above the Aldrat gate at 200 kilometers, then it's the easiest way to do it for you. If you want to do like a load of characters and things you have a character saying on grid, maybe have the first couple of letters of the gate and then a character to say up. Stand that, and that makes it easier for you to just take it in at a glance, then that's good. But try and do it in a way that lets you just look at it, and at a glance you can see where that bookmark is, and you know, because most of the time when you're using a tactical in combat, you'll need to warp to it quite quickly. So I usually do it using the right click menu. So I'll right click and I'll need to be able to select the right bookmark straight away. So just make sure you do it in a clear fashion, I think. It doesn't really matter which system you use as long as it makes sense to you.
Matthew Tench asks, can you tell us about your experience as a fleet commander? What are some of the tips you might have to aspiring fleet commanders, and what kind of challenges should they be looking for?
So I guess the biggest challenge of getting into FCing is there's an awful lot of information that gets thrown at you. And actually processing that information can be quite challenging. So making sure you've got good scouts who know which information you need and which you don't, and make sure you've got a kind of a good second in command who can do things like, you know, maybe watch fleet chat for you, and he can make sure you've got people doing the particular roles that you need, so you don't necessarily have to micromanage everything yourself. That can be really useful. So make sure you've got good trusted people in positions who are filling all the key roles be a big first step. The other thing is that, like soloing, FCing, you're essentially in control of everything, and you're the one that has to make a decision on whether you fight something or not, and gauge whether a particular gang is a gang you can kill or a gang that you can't, just like if you're solo PvPing. So with that in mind, actually going out and being a soloer is really, really good if you want to then get into FCing, because it'll build up your situational awareness, it'll build up your ability to weigh an enemy's composition against yours in a fairly short amount of time and make a decision. And of course, when you're soloing, if you make a wrong decision, you're only losing your own ship. When you're FCing, you've potentially got your gangmate ships to worry about as well. So having a bit of solo experience in advance is a really, really good thing, I think. Otherwise, don't be put off, and don't be overwhelmed by it too much if you can. Bear in mind that even experienced FCs don't think that they're amazing FCs. I don't think I'm that good in FC. Some people go in one of my gangs and then say that I'm absolutely amazing, and I think that's weird, because I don't feel like I'm amazing. I feel like I'm pulling through and doing okay, but I don't feel that good. So even if you're starting out, or if you've been doing it for a while, you might have a gang, do it, and you'll think, oh, that went absolutely terribly, I'm not doing this again. But in actual fact, it probably didn't. And if you asked someone who was one of your gang members, they might actually say, "Oh, no, we thought you did a really good job. I mean, how did you make that decision? That was amazing. Yeah, I wouldn't have known what to do there." So don't be put off if you think that things are going badly, because quite often you might just be critical of yourself, and actually, yeah, things go a lot better than you actually thought they were.
Fruit Frooster asks, could you please give us an opinion on sensor boosters on gang ships that are supposed to deal damage? Do you think it's a good idea to fit sensor boosters on those ships?
I think it's a good idea for ships which need to lock very quickly. So if you are flying a tackling interceptor, for example, having a sensor booster there is not a bad idea. Although, to be honest, I don't fit them on my tackle inties either. If you are alpha striking something, so you're going to maybe be trying to lock up and shoot something so they die in a single volley. So maybe you've got artillery fit and you're trying to lock up these small, fast frigates and kill them quickly. The sensor booster is really useful there because they take a long time to lock, and being able to lock them quickly means that you can quite easily just lock something up, shoot it, and then leave. If you're just a day-to-day damage dealing ship in a gang, I think there's almost always something better that you can fit there. And the difference between you locking something in 3 seconds and locking something in 2 seconds is just not that significant to use up a slot for, I think. Generally, you'll get more utility by fitting some kind of electronic warfare, or fitting an extra tackle mod, or fitting a tracking computer so you can hit extra range. And if you've just got loads of mid-slots and you don't know what to do with them, then sure, go for a sensor booster. But I just don't think they're that useful.
You mentioned that E-War is a good way to get into PvP, or would you recommend going with more conventional combat ships first? I mean, is there a role for pure E-War in small or even solo PvP?
So solo, there's not really a role for E-War. To solo PvP, there's two things you absolutely have to, well, it's one thing you absolutely have to do, and that is deal damage. If you can't deal damage, then you can't solo PvP because you can't kill your target. The other thing that's fairly important, but not necessarily critical, is tackling. You can sometimes solo PvP without tackle, and people just don't realize that they're not tackled and they don't warp off. But it's not recommended. So in terms of being a pure E-War pilot in solo PvP, it doesn't really apply. In small gang though, yeah, absolutely, E-War is a very viable role. It has its place in some gangs and not others, so there might be some gangs that you go on where actually E-War isn't really that useful. So I think it's always good to be able to fly something conventional as well. But E-War definitely has a place, and it's a useful thing to do. In terms of a way to get into PvP, yes, I think it's good. There's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, E-War ships tend to die less often. I know people say that they're really common primary target, and you say, oh, everyone's going to shoot the blackbirds first because they're so fragile and they're so effective. But because you're out at range and you're usually not tackled, if you fly them sensibly, you're aligned to something when you're in the fight, you warp out if you're taking too much damage, you can actually not die too much. Which is quite nice when you're new to the game because it means you don't have to replace those ship losses because you're not losing quite so many of them. The other thing is that flying E-War gets you really used to watching your range and keeping aligned to things and stuff like that. These are really useful skills in PvP in general because actually watching the range on things will be kind of critical later on, especially if you're flying a kiting ship that fights at range. The other thing it's quite useful for as well is if you're going to be making your ISK in hostile space, ratting or running missions in low-sec or null-sec, say, being able to do things like watching out for hostiles and stay aligned and warp out and warp back in at a moment's notice. Those are valuable skills as well. So I think it develops some really useful skills that you'll use later on. Ideally, I would say do a bit of everything. Train the basic E-War skills, train the basic tackling skills, train the basic damage dealing skills, and then just switch it up a little bit. So fly a tackle frigate a few times, then fly a E-War cruiser a few times, and then fly a T1 cruiser fit for damage dealing a few times, and just get a bit of experience with all of it, because they all teach you different skills, and they're all very viable, and also help you decide where you want to be on, which is nice.
Expanding on that question related to E-War, what are your opinions, and this is something Vegas Bellum asks, on electronic attack frigates. You mentioned earlier that a couple of them aren't very good. Tell us your opinion on the EAFs.
So, the big problem, well, two big problems with the EAFs is, first of all, they have quite short targeting range, and that means that even though they have extra mid-slots usually, you actually have to use one of those for a sensor booster if you want to lock out to the same kind of ranges that the other EWAR frigs work at. So that sacrifices some of their effectiveness, really. Or you can fire at closer range. But the problem then is that actually they're not very survivable. Unlike interceptors, they don't have that bonus to micro-warp drive sig radius, so if they use a micro-warp, they're really easy to hit. They actually have quite large signature radii to begin with, so they're easy to hit anyway. They're quite slow, and they're really, really fragile. So the way they're designed at the moment is kind of like as more powerful but closer range EWAR frigs, and actually at that kind of range, they're just too vulnerable. The Kitsune can be a really good ship, actually. Just load a bunch of jammers on there and stay outside of tackle range and just align things and warp out, and it can be really good. The other ones, less so. The Sentinel's a good ship, but not really as an EWAR ship. It's a good ship as a solo neuting ship for killing other frigates. But as a tracking disruptor ship, it's just simply not that much better than a Crucifier. The Galentium Mimitar ones I mentioned before, I thought were the least useful of the lot. And the main problem is that they're just, they don't really have a role where they really work. The Keres is really good for damping, but only within a limited amount of range, and damping there's not that much demand for really specialized damping ships in PvP at the moment. So the Keres doesn't really have a damping role, and its tackle range role is kind of the same thing that an Interceptor gets, except that an Interceptor is faster and smaller. And so the Keres just does that job worse. So it's not really useful for that as well. The Hyena obviously gets this web range bonus, which is brilliant. I mean, if the Hyena was actually a bit faster, had a bit more tank, maybe did a bit of damage, that can make it a great ship. I mean, 20km webs is awesome. But as it is at the moment, if you've got that ship 20km from something webbing it, then it will just die so easily to just about anything, because most larger ships can hit out to 20km without too much of a problem. And it's so fragile and so easy to hit that if it actually tries to make use of that bonus, then it basically relies on people not choosing to shoot it to survive, which isn't really a good strategy. So yeah, I think they're in need of some love from CCP, basically. If they can make them a little bit faster, a little bit more survivable, then I think they could be really useful ships. But at the moment, they're just not that effective.
Shelly asks a question that I know is near and dear to most of the Galenti pilots out there. What, in your opinion, do you think about drone boats in PvP, the Vexor, Ishtar, Myrmidon, etc.?
I think they're great. They're really effective, especially because you don't have to worry about using all the rest of your slots to get most of your damage output. So you can stack up on your armor tank or something, and you can just still do great damage and have a nice tank. The Vexor's a great kind of cheap rolling cruiser, which is very nice. And yeah, the Myrmidon, the Dominic's great as well. Ishtar I don't have too much experience with, but I'm led to believe it's quite a nice ship too. They're very nice, and I think they're going to get even more nice quite shortly, because for those of you who don't know, CCP are planning to introduce damage mods for drones. So you'll get a low slot mod which increases your drone damage, which would be nice. But yeah, I think they're really good, and like missiles, they work in a slightly different way to turret ships, so you have to bear that in mind. You won't necessarily work in quite the same way. You have to worry more about whether your drones can reach something and kind of keep shooting it. They really struggle when they're shooting something really, really quick, like an interceptor, because the drones just can't keep up with it. But they're nice for fighting gangs of smaller ships. So if you're fighting, say, 2 or 3 frigates in your cruiser, Vexor's a great one for that, because even if they get really close, its drones will still hit them just fine. And they're quite versatile all round, really. Like missiles, they tend to struggle a little bit in larger gangs, because obviously their drones have to travel to targets before they die. They can kill them. Targets tend to die very quickly in larger gangs. But for solo in particular, yeah, they're really good. And small gang as well. Maybe a little bit less strong than turrets and missiles in small gang, but still very effective.
John McCann asks, what's your opinion on high-sec ganking?
I think I'm a bit of two minds of it, really. It's a legitimate playstyle, and people definitely enjoy it. So, as far as I see it, if you can just if you do something that you're enjoying, and even that's fine. I think that some people do it just to get a rise out of other people, and I have to admit I don't have a huge amount of respect for that. I think if people can, they can learn the mechanics and they're using those mechanics to get an advantage over someone, then that's great. But if you've got someone who's quite experienced and maybe they should know about it, and you can actually kind of outmaneuver them using the mechanics of the game in high tech, then fair play to you. But I don't know. I think there's a line between using the mechanics to your advantage and achieving something really good, and just messing about with newbies who don't really know any better. And I think that that line is quite easily blurred for a lot of people. So I don't know. It's not something I've done myself, but I definitely don't think that CCP should remove it from the game, because I think having the element of risk there is quite important, and also it brings you slightly more into the kind of constant evolving player-driven world of EVE Online, which is really nice. And the fact that even if you're doing your own thing, you have to think about the other people, and you have to know about the other areas of the game that maybe you don't do yourself. I think that adds something. So I wouldn't want them to take it away or make it impossible to do. But I don't think it's necessarily always done in the best way.
Boniface Vachon asks, how do you feel, or what do you feel are the strengths and weaknesses of logistics for cap chain or solo repair in different PvP situations? What role do you think logistics plays in PvP?
So logistics is basically the backbone of any medium to large fleet. Once you have a gang of, say, 10 or 15 people or more, these days they will almost always have logistics in that gang, and those logistics actually form the core of the gang. So a lot of the tactics in a medium to large fight, well, not so much a large fight because then you can just break through the logistics by using DPS, but in a kind of medium scale fight.
Well, I've got a question from Boniface. What do you feel are the strengths and weaknesses of cap chain logistics and solo logistics in different PvP situations?
Yeah, so cap chain logistics tend to be really, really strong in fairly static situations. So if your gang is going to be kind of sitting there and duking it out, then cap chain logistics are really powerful because you can just link up with people. You don't have to worry about cap at all because you've effectively infinite capacity. So you can just give out really strong reps, you can fit a really strong tank, and you don't have to worry about things like being neutered or anything like that because you're just getting your cap from elsewhere anyway. Once your gang starts to be dynamic and mobile, and you've got ships flying around, the non-cap chain logistics tend to be much stronger, I think. So the Scimitar definitely, and the Nereus as well, with its recent buff, the Nereus is really effective too. Mainly is that as ships start flying around, gangs tend to get very spread out. Both you and your targets will spread out a lot more. And it's quite easy to end up in a situation where a ship gets out of logistics range. So you're having to fly after those ships to stop them from getting out of your range so you can keep repairing them. And at the same time, if you're in a cap chain logistics ship, you'd have to be worrying about where the other logistics ships are as well, and keeping your cap chains going with them. And that's quite challenging. So using the non-cap chain type logistics, the Scimitar and the Nereus for the more dynamic gangs, makes it much simpler for you, because all you have to worry about is keeping in range of the guys who need the reps and keeping the reps going. You don't have to worry about watching yourself on the other logistics too. But of course, so the trade-off of that is that generally those ships will be less tanked, so you'll have to give up some slots for cap regen mods, so you won't have quite as much tank. And also you tend to have a little bit less rep power as well, because you might not be able to fit and run quite as many reps so constantly as the captured logistics can.
Frood Forrester asks, what's your opinion on ECM drones? Especially what is your take on them being used by low SP players like the typical uni player compared to damage drones and ECM drone viability overall?
ECM drones are incredibly viable. They are just a really effective. They're probably the best drone at the moment, especially for a low skill point player, because when you've got low drone skills, obviously your damage drones won't do quite as much damage as they would otherwise. And if you're on T1 drones, that's even more the case. If you're using E-War drones, it doesn't matter what your drone skills are like, they still have a set jam strength. So all that really matters is you've got the hit points and you've got the navigation skills, but other than that, it doesn't really matter too much. And because they don't have any stacking penalty against each other, once you start swarming E-War drones on a target, you are very likely to get a jam, even though their jam strength is only like 1 or 1.5. So if you're finding a gang that has, say, logistics ships, and you just swarm them with a bunch of ECM drones, there's a pretty good chance that you will jam that ship at least every, 1 in 2 or 3 times. And that's quite an achievement, really, especially if you would have otherwise just been using some light damage drones that shouldn't really contribute to the fight. Those E-War drones can make a significant difference. Of course, E-War drones don't do one thing which non-E-War drones do very well, which is act as some kind of anti-tackler defense. They can still be effective against tacklers because you can get a jam off on them and then warp out. But if you're fighting more than one tackler, so if you've got a couple of frigates that are attacking you and you can't hit them with your guns, maybe you're split off from the main fleet, maybe your fleet's warped off somewhere and you're stuck behind, you've been tackled by a couple of people. If you had damage drones, you might be able to actually kill them, or at least do enough damage to them so they warp off. ECM drones don't really do that. The other thing to bear in mind about ECM drones is they're really, really fragile. They've got more speed than normal drones, so if they decide that your ECM drones are causing a problem and they just shoot them, they'll die really quickly, and then you've lost your tackler defense. So I would say ECM drones really useful if you're in a gang. Probably in a kind of medium gang or more, I would just go ECM drones all the time, unless you're using medium or large drones, which actually do a lot of damage. If you're a small gang, again, it depends on your role. They're really good for kiting ships and stuff like that, where you're not expecting to have tacklers up close and personal, but you're going to be flying off from people. If you do get tackled in those situations, quite often it's just one person, and getting E-War drones and getting a lucky jam will help you more than putting damage drones on, which take a while to actually have their effect. If you're solo, then it depends on the kind of ship you're flying. If you're going to be brawling up close and personal with people, I still quite often would go for damage drones, just because if you get in a situation where you've got frigates in close on you and you can't hit them, it's quite nice to actually be able to do some damage to them still. And a flight of light drones can usually kill most frigates, at least if you've got a web on them as well, before they can actually kill you or kill your drones.
Shatras STZ asked, as an MR pilot, there's a perception that lasers are not very viable in PvP because their cap use is way too big. Is there any smaller ships for PvP in which lasers are viable, or how do you make laser boats viable overall for PvP fighting?
So actually, I think this is a common myth. Part of the reason that people think that laser boats aren't very good is because they will look at fits in EFT and they will see, I've got this ship with lasers and it does 400 DPS, but then I can put projectiles on it and do just as much damage, and I've got loads of extra CPU and cap use for tank. But the thing you've got to bear in mind about lasers is that they are all optimal range. So if you've got, especially T2 lasers with Scorch, you can have an optimal range of, say, 20k. That means at 20k you are still doing your full damage. Projectiles and hybrids don't do that. You might still have an optimal fall off that lets you hit out to 20k, but at that point you're doing much reduced damage. So once you get outside of that kind of point blank into a mid-range area, lasers are probably the best weapon system. Well, not probably. Lasers are definitely the best weapon system in the game for that kind of area. So I think for medium and large ships, definitely lasers are absolutely amazing. Like battle cruisers and battleships, lasers are probably my favorite weapon system, I would say. The thing about small ships is that the range is slightly less of an advantage, because you tend to get in really close and personal, and you're very fast. So sure, being able to hit out to like 10-15k is quite useful, but when you're going 1-2 kilometers a second, it doesn't really take much effort to get in a little bit closer, where projectiles or blasters would hit as well. The other thing, and I think this is more problem with the ships themselves at the moment than the weapon system, is that a lot of the Amar frigates and T1 cruisers are really difficult to fit, and fitting projectiles on those gives you a lot more fitting room, so it means you can actually fit a decent tank and decent weapons and stuff like that, whereas at the moment it's quite hard to do that using lasers, just because the ships are hard to fit and they use a lot of power grid in particular. So hopefully that will be solved a little bit when they do the T1 frigate and T1 cruiser balancing, but otherwise I would say don't be put off with it too much. I've still seen people do absolutely amazing things with like laser punishers and laser omens and laser mallows, stuff like that. Even though they get a bit of a bad reputation, I have seen people do great things with them. And once you get to battle cruisers like the Harbinger, lasers are an absolutely brilliant weapon system, so don't feel like you're getting the short end of the stick at all here. Absolutely not.
Alright, Nair Aldreo asks, would you mind giving a short overview about the different NPC nullsec regions in your experience? Who's kind of doing what? And there's also another question from Aldo Hanso. I believe you're familiar with low-sec camp and tactics, and I was wondering if you could give a brief overview to everyone using your experience on those regions and what you feel is going on in those areas.
Sorry, what was the second question?
The second question is, I believe you're familiar with low-sec camp and tactics. What do you consider as strengths and weaknesses in terms of small game tactics? But I think you could also possibly answer which low-sec regions you're familiar with and what kind of goes on in those regions.
Okay, I might need some clarification on that question because I'm not sure what it's asking, but I'll answer the first one first anyway, about NPC nullsec. So there's quite a lot of difference between the NPC nullsec regions, even though you'd think that they're just, there's not that much difference between one region and another. I mean, what's the difference between High Mitar and Metropolis? There is actually a lot of difference there, but we won't get into that. But actually, the geography of the regions makes quite a big difference, I think. Those of you who read my blog, you'll be able to find there's a couple of articles I've written on there on Syndicate and Curse, which are two of the NPC nullsec regions. There's a few others as well, but obviously I haven't written about those. The things to look out are, if you look on Dotlan, or some kind of EVE maps, so Dotlan or OMB or the EVE strategic maps, whichever one you prefer, have a look at the layout of the systems and have a look at how many stations there are and how many alternate routes there are between locations. Those two things make a huge difference. The other thing, of course, is how many connections to Empire space they have and how far away from Empire space they are. So if we start with the ones which are actually bordering Empire, we have three NPC nullsec regions which border Empire space, and that is Syndicate, Curse, and Great Wildlands. Syndicate and Curse have both got loads of stations, and what that means is they are really quite busy regions. You will find people in most systems, and if you go there looking for a fight, you'll almost definitely find a fight. You may find one against slightly more ships than you'd be hoping for, but you'll almost definitely find something. Because they've got so many stations, they're really easy regions to live in and keep some supplies in. You don't have to worry about being camped into a station or anything, because there's so many stations there you could dock in. They are also, they tend to be the main homes of small gang PvP, I'd say, because there's not really any reason to go into them if you're not a small gang PvP group, especially Syndicate. And Curse is kind of a route into Scolding Pass and Catch, so sometimes you get people going through to solve regions there, but Syndicate, there's not really any reason to be there if you're not a solo or a small gang PvPer, so it tends to be good for that kind of stuff. Great Wildlands is a bit different because it only has 3 systems that have stations in, and that means it will be a lot quieter. If you go out there, you're less likely to run into someone, and if you do, it'll be around those systems. That makes it quite a good region for solo PvP, because you're not going to find as many gangs there, and the ones you do find, you'll find it easier to evade. Also, Great Wildlands has a lot of alternate routes, so if you find that there's a camp somewhere, or there's some guys you don't want to fight, you can quite often find another way round, which is nice. Syndicate you can kind of do as well, apart from one pipe in the middle, between MHC and PF-. Curse is notoriously the other end. Curse is like one big pipe. So while it's a great place to PvP, it was the first nullsec region I lived in, and it's a really good fun place to go. If you go deeper into Curse, you can quite often find that there's a camp that stops you going any deeper, which is a little bit annoying. After that, you've got a couple of other regions which are deeper into nullsec space. So you've got Outer Ring, which you can get to through Syndicate. That's one that you guys have access to. You don't have to go to any sov space to get there. Outer Ring is kind of like Great Wildlands, though, in that it's pretty quiet. There's not much there. I'd say it's not a great place to go to PvP, really. The other two are Venal and Stain. These ones you have to go through sov space to get to. So for E-UNI guys, you won't be able to get there at the moment with your current rules. In terms of PvP, I don't know much about Stain because I've never really been there very much. Venal I have lived in, and that tends to be, I guess it's kind of like a mixture between the other ones, but you've also got all these sov guys around there as well. So it's a really good place to live if you want to fight the guys who do sov stuff, and maybe fight them in slightly larger gangs. And it's also a good place to make money because it's so deep into nullsec. The quality of the rats and the anomalies is really high, so a great place to make money. Curses are right for money as well, but Syndicate and Great Wildlands tend to be pretty bad for it. Other than that, when you're living somewhere deep like Venal, you have to bear in mind that actually getting your stuff out there is quite a challenge, and you've got to bear that in mind when making your decision, I think. What was the next question? Was it low-sec camping tactics?
Yeah, I misread that. I believe you're familiar with low-sec camp and its tactics. Would you please consider elaborating on their strengths and weaknesses in terms of small gang tactics?
This is tactics for camping in low-sec.
That's correct.
I'm not that familiar with camping in low-sec, to be honest. I'm not a huge fan of camping because it's really boring. You're kind of just sitting in one place and you're completely reliant on someone stumbling into you to actually be able to kill them, and you just have to hope that when someone does stumble into you, it's something that you can kill. So, I don't know. It's not something that I do. I'm more familiar with it in terms of avoiding camps than actually doing them. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about both sides of the coin. If you're setting up a camp, the most important thing is picking the right spot. You've got to pick somewhere where you're going to get traffic, and you've got to pick somewhere where you get the right kind of traffic. So don't go somewhere where you get loads and loads of big gangs rolling through, because then you're just going to be having to move off all the time. That's going to be really annoying. Try and pick somewhere where you have a lot of lone people traveling, or where small gangs tend to roam a little bit. Pipe system or choke point is quite good. A system where everyone has to come through. That's a really good place because you get a lot of traffic there. Make sure when you're setting up a camp you have good intel. So make, at the absolute minimum, have something cloaked or off-grid on the far side of your gate so you can see what's there, or at least see what's on the scan. You can see where the local is climbing in that system. If you can, also have eyes the other way, so the system that people will be travelling to after your system, so you've got eyes on both sides. Sometimes people will bait a camp by trying to send someone in through your camp and having a gang waiting on the other side to come through into your system from the other gate when you've actually engaged them. So try and have eyes both sides if you can. And then obviously, if you can get them even further up the pipe as well, then that's great. But that's obviously relying on quite a few scouts. That's fewer people in the actual camp. The other thing is, of course, you don't want to give the game away too much. So having a massive camp sitting on a gate all the time, it's a little bit obvious, and people will see it, and eventually people might say, oh, they've got this gang here, so let's fit up a Sino ship and we'll go and hot drop them or something, and then some guys come and hot drop you with a big battleship fleet. So be a little bit subtle if you can. Maybe have a few guys on the gate with their fast tackle and stuff, and have the rest of your guys off gate, or maybe spread people out among gates so it doesn't look like a huge camp and doesn't look like a great target. And then as soon as someone tackles something, you can go in and get them, which is quite good. Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't cut you off.
That's right. In terms of evading camps, because I just want to mention this as well, it's not what the question was asking, but it's something worth mentioning. Again, look at maps, try and figure out where the choke points are going to be. If there's a system which everyone has to go through, then be a bit wary when you go there, because there's quite a high chance of a camp. Look at Dotlan. You can see on there the number of kills in a system in the last hour. So if you're going out roaming, look for systems which have high kills in the last hour. Those are probably going to be a camp, so if you've got another way to go around while I'm going through there, then that's not a bad idea. You can also use the in-game map and see number of people in the system, which is quite useful, although people in the system doesn't necessarily mean a camp.
Alright. Almighty Mo asks, and I know Agony has a very great class on this. Two-part question. Do you make it a priority that any system that you PvP in regularly, that you have safe spot and tactical bookmarks? And secondly, when engaging in PvP, is it better to fight conservatively or more aggressively?
So I used to make it a priority. I used to, when we moved to the system, I would get bookmarks for the whole region. And that would be one of the first things that I did. These days I don't do it quite so much. It's definitely less important in low sec and high sec. In null sec, it's at least not necessarily safe spots, but getting a bookmark on grid with each gate is really important because it means you can evade bubbles. So you can warp to your bookmark and then down to the gate, and if there's a bubble on the gate, you won't get dragged in by it. However, even in null sec, I don't make it quite as much a priority as I used to. I think it's really important, as I said earlier, if you're scouting. If you do a lot of scouting for gangs, having those bookmarks means you can travel around a lot faster. In null sec this is, because you can evade bubbles, you don't have to get caught by a bubble and get to the gate, and it means that because you're going to be going into complete uncharted territory in front of your gang, you're not putting yourself in too much risk, because if you're a scout, staying alive is quite important, because if you die, then your gang has no one to scout them. And that means that they don't have any eyes in front and the gang's not more vulnerable. If you're out soloing or just PvPing in a small gang, then actually I would say it's not quite as important. You can afford to be a little bit more reckless, especially if you're soloing in something which wants to fight in close range. Like that Ferox fit I linked earlier, that is a close range fit. It's got scram, web, and blasters. So quite often I will just warp directly to gates even in nullsec if I don't think there's a big gang in system, because if there is someone camping a bubble on the out gate, then I will land exactly where I want to be anyway, which is right on top of them. So you can easily over-rely on bookmarks, and that's maybe not that good a thing. In low sec and high sec, they are much less important. They're mainly useful for cloaky scouts, because you can then sit at one off gate and you can watch people going in and out through the gate. For general PvP, they're good to have because it means, if you are, say you're with a gang on a gate and someone gets tackle on somebody about 50k off you, and you're quite slow, you could walk up to your bookmark and then walk back down to them instead of having to fly towards them. But you can kind of do that just by walking to a nearby planet or belt anyway, so it's not the end of the world. So I would say, yes, useful to have. Definitely do them around your home system, because that's somewhere where you'll do a lot of PvP, and it's good to have that home advantage, as I said. In nullsec, get them off gates, like 250 kilometers, one off each gate. The safe spots and off grids are less important, I think. I don't tend to find I use them quite as much. But you can still manage without them, and you can also make them on the fly as well. Just don't make them on the fly while you're FCing or scouting a gang, because then kind of everyone's waiting for you while you make your bookmarks, and that's not ideal.
All right, thank you. Bart Tolak asks, for tacklers, is it better to do on-ship sensor boosting, or have remote sensor boosting applied to it for faster lock times? And to expand that question, for fast tacklers, is it better to go with long-range points in a web, a scram in a web, or a long-range point in a scrambler?
So, okay. In terms of straightforward effectiveness, a remote sensor booster does more than a local one, but it also has some effort to kind of actually set it up. It means you have to be in the same place as the person with a remote sensor booster, which you won't necessarily always be, and it means you have to be coordinated with them. If you're doing a fairly static gate camp, like what you guys would call a defensive gate camp, where you are just going to sit on one gate and you're going to be at close range on the gate, remote sensor boosting there is pretty useful, because you know you're going to be in the same place as the guy. So you can arrange with one of your fleet mates, and can you fit a couple of remote sensor boosters and put them on me, and that way I can use my mid slots for tackle mobs and a bit of extra tank and stuff like that. If you're on a roaming gang, I would say don't go for remote sensor boosting, just because you can't rely on being in the same place as your guy with a remote sensor booster, and also you might be flying off at range from your gang and stuff like that, and you'd be out of range. So there, it's better to have a local one than a remote one. That said, as I mentioned earlier, I don't fit sensor boosters on my interceptors anymore. I think the only place where a sensor booster is actually useful in terms of locking speed is when you're actually at zero on a gate and you're catching someone who comes through, and that's actually not when most of our fights happen. When you're actually flying around off gates and when you're fighting someone who's already in the same system as you, not just catching them on a gate, locking time is not that important. Locking range is still very important, but I don't think it's worth using a mid-slot to get that. I would usually just fit one of the ionic field projector rigs, which are the targeting range rigs. I'd fit one of those if I want extra targeting range, and then use my mid-slots for tackle mods and for a shield tank and stuff like that. In terms of which mods to use, I would say if you are a specialized fast tackle, and that is your job is to tackle something before it can warp off, then what you want to do is you want to go for a long point, and then use any extra slots you have for either a sensor booster if you want one, tank, and if you've got an extra mid slot, then go for a scrambler. Now, the reason for that is once you've caught someone, you stop them warping away, quite often they will just start flying away from you, and even though you've got them tackled, you might be the only ship that can actually keep up with them, and if you can't get a scrambler on them, no one else is going to keep up, they're not going to die. So quite often you will have to actually dive into range and get a scrambler on them so you can slow them down and get everyone there to catch up. The best ship to do that in is an interceptor, by an absolute mile. This is because interceptors can run a micro warp drive without increasing the signature radius too much. So interceptor running its micro warp drive can basically keep going forever and not hit, because its signature radius are still really small, it's really fast, and also they get a bonus to their cap use of warp disruptors. So the warp disruptor, they can keep that running as well. A normal Tech 1 frigate will usually cap out quite quickly if it tries running a micro warp drive and a warp disruptor. If you don't have an interceptor, then you can do this in a Tech 1 frigate, but just bear in mind your job is just to tackle something, and then once someone else has it tackled, you can turn off your tackle and turn off your micro warp drive, and if you have to, just warp off because you've done your job. Your job is just to grab them before they warp away and let Tech 1 frigate is just, it struggles after that point, I think. The most useful tackling role, I would say, in most gangs, is a scram tackler. Someone who can get a scram on a target. That's, I would say, 3/4 of the fights that we have, or I had when I was in Agony, that would be the tackler that we really needed. We'd come into a gang and someone would try and get away from us, and we need to get a scram on them so they can't fly away, and then our DPS ships can get on top of them. And you can't do that without a fast ship with a scram. So that's either a scram, a micro warp drive if you can, and then plenty of tank as well, because you want to make sure you're going to get that scram and you're going to stay there until people can catch up. And that's a really useful role to have. I'd say if you're getting into tackling, that's probably what I'd go for, rather than doing the long point stuff, which I think is better done by more experienced guys in an interceptor. I would just go for warp scrambler, maybe a web, make sure you've got some tank on there as well, and just go for that, because that just works. But just to reiterate, tank your tacklers. Don't fit like a T1 frigate with no tank at all, and just like a warp disruptor, a web, a micro warp drive, and a bunch of speed mods, because then it's going to go super fast and it's going to tackle things. But people know that frigates are fragile. They know that if they get tackled, then they can't escape. So the time that you tackle someone and your tackle is actually what's making that difference. You've tackled someone, and if they don't get rid of you, they're going to die. Then they will do whatever they can to get rid of you. They will put their drones on you, they will shoot you, and if you have no tank, you will die in seconds, and that target will get away. So if you have a damage control, you have a medium shield extender, they're going to take a little bit longer to do that. And in that time, your gang's going to get on top of them, and then that's made the difference between you losing a fight, and losing the target, and you killing that target. So absolutely, fit tank on your tacklers. I'd say it's even more important than sensor boosters. It's more important than webs. It's probably more important than fitting those overdrives and nanos too, is to get a bit of tank on there.
Alright, the next question coming up is Maven Einstein asks, he dual boxes on E. What's the viability and the scope for viability when dual boxing in PvP?
So you can dual box in PvP. It's difficult to do, depending on the roles that you are filling. I would advise not trying to fill too intense, concentration intensive roles. Like, don't do a logistics ship and a damage dealing ship, because you're just not going to be able to fly both of those effectively at the same time. But dual boxing something like a scout and a damage dealing ship, well, scout and the FC is quite good because then you've got the intel and you're commanding the fleet as well. Or like a T3 booster if you're using fleet boosters and something else in the fleet as well can be good. But basically, if you're doing one thing where it's quite simple and one thing where you actually have to concentrate on it, that can be quite effective because you can still give all your concentration to the ship that needs it and you can still fly it on as well. But I'd say it's challenging to do, and some people will find it easier than others. Some people really struggle with dual box. I'm not great at dual boxing myself. I quite often forget about my other screen because I'm concentrating too much on one. Some people seem to be able to do like 2 resource-intensive DPS ships at the same time and pull it off great, but that can be tricky, I think.
All right. Next question is from Matthew Tenchi, and he's asking on your experience as a director and CEO of a corporation. How do you get other players to rally under one flag and keep them there? Also, how do you manage to regularly get them organized and undocking in teams and groups?
So just to be clear, I wasn't the CEO of Agony, I was just a director, but I was doing a lot of the actually managing the corp. Our CEO has been CEO for quite a long time, and sometimes he's away from game and stuff like that. I know E-UNI was in a similar situation at times, so yeah, I wasn't the CEO though. But yeah, in terms of actually leading the corp and getting things happening, it's a challenge. I'm not gonna lie about that. It takes effort and it takes commitment, and there's some days that you'd really like to just log on and go out and do your own thing and go soloing or something, but you can't really because you know that if you don't make something happen, it's not going to happen, and your corporate relying on you for that. One thing that really helps is getting people, getting some FCs who are really enthusiastic and actually will help make stuff happen. That makes a huge difference. If you've got good FCs that people that will log on and say, right, I'm going out for a wave, and suddenly the whole corp will say, yeah, let's go and do that, then that's great. But they can be hard to come by, and you can't necessarily guarantee having them. Agony was fortunate in that we had quite a few. If you're a PvP corp, I think obviously you can help with that, because if you create a situation where you foster new FCs, so you get someone who has an FC before and you say, oh, come on, run a gang, we'll bring our cheap Tier 1 frigates and cruisers and we'll just go out in a gang, and who cares if we die, because it's just good fun. And that way you get people who haven't FC'd before to go out and do it, and then some of those people, and I'd say the majority of those people, they run a gang or two, and then they've done their thing, and then they go back to just being another +1 in the fleet. But occasionally you'll have someone who does that and really likes it, and then they end up being one of these FCs who makes things happen. So I'd say absolutely nurturing your newbies and getting them, trying to get the spark ignited so they actually end up being an active PvP and regular FC is absolutely critical. The other thing, of course, is just, and this is true whether you're the CEO or director or just a normal person in the corp, don't just always assume that someone else will make things happen, even if it's not necessarily your job. It might be that you've got someone who's in charge of something, but if it's not happening, just make it happen. Don't wait for someone else to do it and say, well, it's not my concern, because you'll just end up in a situation where things aren't happening and everyone is annoyed. So even if you're just a normal person in the corp, if you see something that needs doing and it's not getting done, whether this is in a fight, because no one's calling targets because the FC's dead, you step up and call targets, or whether it's outside, like, you find that the wiki is in a bad state of repair and no one's really managing it, or you find there's a particular class that no one's teaching and you think, right, okay, I should step up and do that. It makes a huge difference. Just be aware though, if you do that, you might end up being in charge of things eventually. That seemed to happen to me, but I think it's worth it in the end, and without people doing that, a corp wouldn't function, and it's really important.
All right. I have a question from Fruit Forrester. Is it worth it in your experience to carry specific hardeners or additional refitting modules in your cargo hold while you're out on a roam? And is it more important to be able to refit to handle those specific damage types, or refit for specifically the situation? What types of gear is good for that, and how much should one bring?
So this is interesting, actually. I used to be in the camp where I brought everything for every possible scenario. So like in Minmatar's ship, I bring all flavors of ammo so I could pick my damage type, and I bring some spare nanite pests and some spare drones and some like cat boosters to give some guys in the gang if they needed them. I never got to the point where I actually carried spare hardeners and like spare evil mods, but I know sometimes like we might have a Griffin pilot who would carry the jammer that he didn't have, and then if we found someone who needed to be jammed with that kind of ECM, he could dock up and switch. And I think, yeah, it's kind of useful, but you can get into a situation where you're trying to set everything up. So you find someone to fight, but then you think, oh wait, okay, I'm going to quickly dock and then fit my explosive hardener and my Minmatar ECM or whatever, and then I can go and fight them again, and then I'll win. And then by the time you've done that, you've missed the fight. So often, if you want to actually get the fight and kind of pounce on the opportunity, you don't really have time to dock up and change things anyway. The other thing, of course, is think about the length of your roam and whether you're going to be able to dock up and do things. This also applies to things on your fit as well, like whether you decide to fit an armor rep and stuff like that, or whether you can dock up and repair. And whether you carry nanite paste to repair your modules if you overheat them, or whether you're just going to dock up and repair heat damage. So think about where you're roaming, think about whether there's going to be stations you can dock in, whether you're going to have time to dock, how long you're going to roam for, what you're expecting to encounter. Sometimes it's quite useful, sometimes actually it's just carrying extra ISK which you'll lose if you die. Quite recently, I've been PvPing places which have lots of stations. I have loads of spare mods scattered around, things like that, so quite often I will actually just I will basically have the ship, the ammo that's in the guns, one flight of drones, like no spare drones, even if I have the drone bay, and maybe a little bit of extra ammo just in case I need to reload. And then I'll go out and PvP because I know that I'm not going very far, so after a fight I'll come back and get some more stuff anyway. And if I'm out soloing, I don't want to just be carrying like 2,000 rounds of every ammo type and all these spare modules and stuff, and then I just lose the ship and then I've lost all that stuff as well. So I've actually ended up in a situation now where I carry almost no spare stuff. So I think it can be useful, but I wouldn't overdo it. And generally, if you find that you need it a lot, so if you find that quite often you'll get into a situation where you think, I really wish I had an explosive hardener in my cargo right now, because right now I do have time to use it and I would use it, then maybe start doing it. If you don't find yourself in that situation, or if you find that you are carrying that stuff and you never use it, then don't take it because it's just wasted money.
All right. The last question I currently have for you, and then we'll hand it over to Neville, is in Tata Crease asks, are there any corps that you can think of that consistently turn out good PvPers as opposed to just attracting PvPers? Or do you have any suggestions for a Unista's next step to move into PvP alliances and corporations once they have finished with their time here in the university?
So this is where I get to earn some brownie points, of course, and say EVE University produces really good PvPers. When we were recruiting people for Agony, the guys from EVE University would always just end up being really good recruits. They weren't necessarily really experienced PvPers, but they'd got that kind of like learning mentality. They understood the basics of the game, and actually, even if they didn't have the PvP experience, they became really good in a really short amount of time. So, EVE University, very successful. In terms of your next steps, I would say Agony, go join Agony. They are a great corp, but there are loads of other corps out there as well. So it's not the only one. Find something that works for you. It's not like there are just a small number of corps which are decent. There are loads of really good corps out there. So find somewhere that does the kind of PvP you want to do, that has the kind of attitude that you like. Some corps take things very seriously. They'll have a really professional attitude to PvP. Examples that I know of are, well, Rooks and Kings would be quite a good example, and somebody like a high-sec Merc Corps and stuff like that will be quite serious about, in terms of, these are the fits that we use, and this is the kind of thing we do, this is our procedure, and that can be really good if that's what you're looking for, but not if you're not looking for it. Whereas on the other hand, you might have some corps, for example, the guys in Test Alliance, really casual approach to PvP, kind of don't take things seriously at all, just have some fun. And that can be great if that's what you're looking for, but then if you're wanting some guys who take things seriously and do a really professional job, you might not be happy there as well. So find somewhere that does the kind of PvP you want, that has the kind of attitude to PvP that you like, and also just have a look at their kill boards, talk to some of their guys, get an idea of whether they actually do what you think they do, or whether they've just got this reputation and actually that's not what happens. You might find there's a corp that you think is a corp of amazing solo PvPers, but then actually most of their kills are not solo. They just fly around in gangs, and maybe you might find that all their solo kills are just done with like Falcon ults and stuff like that, so they're not really proper solo kills anyway, and actually they're not the corp they were. So once you found something that you like, just make sure that they are actually what you think. Quite often you can end up joining a corp that you thought was going to be absolutely amazing, and then they're just not quite as good as you thought they were going to be. So just be careful, especially if you're planning to stay there for quite a long time. But yeah, there are loads of corps out there, and I'm pretty confident that you can find one without me telling you one particular corp to join.
Azual, I do think it's time for us to wrap this up. We've been going at this for about 2 hours now, so thank you very much. Fascinating interview. We couldn't get to everyone's questions, and I apologize for that, but Azual, maybe we can get you back to rejoin us at a future date.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do something else sometime. So if there's a particular topic that people want to talk about, and you'd like me to come back and maybe have a lecture focused on that, then we can absolutely do that. Post some feedback in the thread on the forum and let me know what you think.
Excellent. That, folks, we're going to go ahead and close off. I want to thank everyone for their participation. Azual, thank you once again for joining us. And good luck, everyone, and fly safe.